Hi, I'm Dennis Metzler, and welcome to The Charge. Today we are taking a look at the letter of the Philippians, along with Dr. Mark A. Jennings, professor of New Testament from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and the author of The Price of Partnership in the letter of Paul to the Philippians. Dr. Jennings, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Dennis. It's a pleasure to be with you.
All righty, so let's start with various approaches. How have scholars, Christian thinkers over the years, over the centuries, approached Philippians in terms of assigning a central purpose or many different purposes or no purpose at all?
Excellent. It's been interesting. When I started to study my dissertation, my first rule was I didn't want to do Romans because of all the scholarship I would have to read on that. So I thought Philippians would be a lot easier, right? Just 4 chapters. But one of the things that I noticed was the amount of discussion that went around just what Paul was doing in Philippians. And largely speaking, for the most part, the consensus for centuries has been that Paul has a lot of things he wants to talk about in Philippians, and he hits a bunch of different subjects. And one of the scholars I really like, his name is Gerald Hawthorne. He calls it a conversation among friends, meaning that it weaves in and out without a through line. There's been a couple of people who have looked for sort of major themes that might run through it. One of the things I've done with my work actually is argue that there is a central theme. Doesn't mean Paul doesn't have secondary things, but there is a through line that goes through. But that's one of the interesting things I think about Philippians, and even leads to, and I think we'll get into it later, conversations about, was it one letter or was it a composition of letters that came through? Because it seems like there's a multiplicity of topics and themes in the letter.
So what would you say are the most noteworthy attempts at assigning purpose? Especially more contemporary?
Yeah, so probably I would say the general theme, what you get a lot is on the idea of unity, and most will argue, Hansen does this, Silvel does this. They argue that Paul is addressing unity concerns within the Philippian church, and trying to make sure that church stays together and cohesive. Fee does some work where he says Paul's not really interested in the gift, but uses that as the sort of excuse to give instruction to the letter to the Philippians about how they're supposed to live their lives sort of in the city. I have a different view of the gift on that, but I think those are probably 2 of the more predominant themes. Now, generally speaking, everyone is in agreement that it's a very joyful letter. It's not a heavy rebuke like you might feel with Galatians, for example. So there's certainly consensus that it's a letter of joy.
And how would you describe what you see as the central thrust of Philippians?
Sure. I think the heart of Philippians is this church's partnership with Paul in Paul's mission. That is the through line, that the Philippian church was one of those churches that Paul trusted to be a financial support of his, trusted to be in partnership with him, and that he is celebrating the fact that they're continuing and encouraging them to continue in that partnership. So that's why I think the gift is essential. So Epaphroditus comes with a gift from the Philippians to Paul while Paul's in prison. And I think that was a moment of great joy for the apostle, because that signaled to him that the Philippians were still with him. They were still supporting him. There had been a pause. Something had happened that had caused them to pause, and I have some thoughts on that, but that was no longer. They had renewed their support. And so I think Philippians is Paul writing to that church to encourage them to persevere, to stay the course in their partnership with him and with the gospel mission. And so there's a question of unity, if you will, but it's not a disunity within the church, but it's an encouragement of unity of the church with Paul in his mission. So I think that's what Philippians runs through, is that call to be partners together in the gospel.
All righty, and you have 3 particular things that matter: fellowship, rivals, and money. So you
Right.
see those
So that,
three throughout.
yes, so that koinonia matters. Like koinonia, the Greek word there for fellowship, which when we think of fellowship, we often think of fellowship in a lower sense. By that I mean we have a fellowship hall at a church. It's a place where people gather and they have coffee and they interact at a social level. Fellowship, in the way that koinonia has a kind of an elevated sense to it. And here's what I mean by that: it has the idea of really a partnership, of an agreement to sort of be partners in a enterprise. We often see koinonia language used in economics of the ancient world and business relationships. And here, I think that same idea is being used in the church's relationship with Paul. In fact, we find a very interesting language in Galatians on this, which might help us understand, where Paul and James and John enter into a right hand of fellowship. If you notice, that context where they enter into fellowship has an agreement of what apostles are going to be overseeing what area, the Gentiles versus the Jews. So there is partnership language. So partnership matters. Rivals matter. One of the things we get this picture that early Christianity is sort of this single group going out proclaiming who Jesus is, and everything else is pagan. What we actually have is there are multiple sort of messages, if you will, about Jesus going out. And there are the orthodox message, and then there's the heretical message. Obviously, Galatians is a great example of this, but where there are a right view of Christ, if you will, and a wrong view of Christ. And there's these almost rival competitions happening alongside going out into a pagan world. And so these rivals idea matter. And I think Paul is really working with the churches to make sure they are aligned with the God-ordained mission and gospel, and not with an erroneous view of the gospel. And then finances matter. That it's not something mundane, if you will. How God's treasure is given to God's people to use for God's purposes, and that has an almost sacramental sense, if you will, like an obedient sense in that. And so for Paul, the receiving of money wasn't just good. It was evidence that the Philippian church is remaining faithful, to the gospel and to the gospel mission, and so it increases its view, if you will, of something as mundane as money.
So in your title, you use the word price, the price of partnership. What are you getting at there?
Sure. So that I think in the price language, what I'm trying to accomplish a couple of things. One is, use some language that evokes finances, right? And that, but also that talks about perseverance language. Throughout Philippians, there is evidence of different individuals that are, including Christ himself, that are being presented in a, persevering, through hardship for the gospel, and the price of that's paid, if you will, to that's demanded. Maybe that's a better way of thinking of it, for commitment to God's plan. And so there's that price idea is yes, there's financial aspects to it that are part of this partnership, part of this fellowship, but also there is an acceptance that suffering is going to be part of this, that the way of Christ is the way of the cross, and persevering in that and seeing God's hand behind that. So that price language picks up for both of those ideas.
So you had quite a few people responding to your book and offering reviews, published reviews. So that must have been very encouraging. So
yeah, it's always one of those moments where you're like, read, buckle up, right? to see, right?
At least they're engaging you, whether they agree or not.
That's right.
So what would you say is like the main thrust of the critiques you received, and then how would you respond to those critiques?
Sure. So and so I'm sort of very upfront in the start of my book that I'm in presenting a single theme that threads through Philippians, that governs Philippians, that I'm doing something different. And it's generally the reviews have I think been quite encouraging in the sense of saying yes, that I'm presenting an argument, a cogent argument, something that does seek to accomplish what it's doing. And then its criticisms are that I see what I'm looking for, which is even in my work in the introductory materials, I acknowledge like there's always a possibility that when you're arguing that something can be read through a particular lens, that you're going to make everything fit that lens. And what I've hoped is that the lesser convincing areas, if you will, like if someone's to say, well, that doesn't seem to fit exactly, at first blush under that argument, makes sense in the more convincing, like there's the heavier presence. And so if there's a heavier framework or heavier lens that is louder in volume, if you will, that some of the more subtle notes, will make sense. But I think that's probably by and large has been the most predominant criticism. You get some things like, discussion about how I don't talk about this or I don't talk about that, but I wasn't writing a commentary. So there are pieces that don't get as much heavier treatment because I'm looking at a lens. And that's fine. But I think that's probably been generally the criticism that I've received is that there are places where my argument isn't as strong as others. And I would say probably, in response to that, I think that's time will tell. I mean, I think with anything with research and scholarship, you just as I've stood on the ideas of others, there's been people, who I've looked at that said, yeah, I think I see that. And I like that here. Hopefully people will come afterwards and look at my work and analyze it, and it'll stand and bear fruit, or it will be a good idea and put back on a shelf, and we go from there until we all get to glory and God tells us, you guys are all idiots. Here's exactly what I was trying to say at that. We'll see.
There you go. Well, let's get deeper into the letter. Can you give us the background history of the city of Philippi, something
Sure.
about its culture, its makeup,
So
etc.?
the city of Philippi is, I think has a fascinating history, named for, Philip of Macedon, right, who we know as the, father of Alexander the Great. And so already kind of has a unique place right there. One of the factors we see when we read Philippians is we see a lot of citizenship language. And I don't think that's necessarily accidental, because one of the great battles of Roman history was fought right there at Philippi. So if you know your Shakespeare, if nothing else, you remember Julius Caesar was killed. Caesar was killed. And then you had sort of this, Mark Antony and who later become Octavius Caesar Augustus, going up against Brutus and Cassius. Well, the deciding battle of those two groups was fought at Philippi, and Philippi, by and large, took the side of the winning generals. Like they sided with Antony, and so that ended up paying huge dividends for Philippi. It received citizenship. And a lot of military presence sort of came in, and so we see that, and even in Acts when Paul is, and Luke is recounting Paul's visit to Philippi in Acts, there's talk about citizenship and identity. So we see a heavy presence there. We also see less presence of, it seems, of a Jewish population. Paul's practice is when he would go into a city, would begin in the synagogue, and to have a synagogue, you needed a quorum of Jewish men to be able to have a synagogue. That was pretty small, like 10. Well, Paul doesn't find that at Philippi. Instead, there's sort of a place of prayer that is located sort of outside by the water, and where Lydia, he meets with Lydia and sort of begins the start of the church at Philippi there. So it doesn't seem like there's a heavy Jewish presence. Now, again, we're not as confident in that, but at least looking at the history of Acts. And so it's a very unique place just in terms of its own history and its composition that sort of makes up the citizenship, which I think feeds into why Paul talks about citizenship language quite a lot in Philippians.
And we're going to get into a lot more details later about what's going on in the church, but what can you offer now up front as a background to the state of the church at Philippi?
Yeah, so one of the church seems to be, I guess if I would use sort of modern language, a healthy church. So often in Paul's letters, there's something that is a crisis that is needing to be corrected or resolved in a pretty strong manner. And it seems like the church at Philippi isn't suffering from that. I mean, there's some disunity, tension there, but not in a real heavy way. It doesn't. This is why I push back against people who argue that there is disunity at Philippi. I'm like, read 1 Corinthians. Read 1 Corinthians. That's what Paul sounds like when he's writing to a church that's just in schisms and factions. And he's not subtle about it. You don't have that kind of tone in Philippians. And this was a church that was supporting Paul, with their finances. Paul references leadership right off the bat in his introduction to the letter of Philippians, which is unusual. Usually just cites to all the saints or to all the believers of a church. Here he actually signals out even leadership offices. So it seems to be a church that received the gospel and was growing and was healthy and was moving forward in their work. As I kind of want to always say, if I summarize Galatians, 1 Corinthians, and Philippians, it's Galatians is sort of come back, 1 Corinthians is come further, and Philippians is keep going, because that's what it seems to, I see that church is a really healthy church that loved Paul and had good relationships with him.
All righty. And what can you say about the integrity of the letter? And could you define that term when it's used in this context?
Sure. So when you hear people talk about the integrity of the letter, what they're sort of talking about is, was it one letter, one single composition? Or was it multiple compositions, multiple letters that at some point in history were sort of put together and handed down as one letter? So integrity doesn't mean an authorship question or an authorship challenge per se. It's not talking about theological, considerations. It's really talking about, was this one letter or not, a single composition? And up until probably relatively recently, the last couple hundred or so years had really challenged the idea that Philippians was a single letter. And partly because there's some things that seem to happen in Philippians that indicate it might be different letters. So for example, Paul waits until the very end of the letter to really talk about the gift in a very direct way. At least this is what a lot of scholars think. And they think, okay, so maybe Epaphroditus arrives with the letter. Paul quickly sends out a thank you for the support and then follows up later with an additional letter as a way of trying to explain why would Paul wait until the very end to acknowledge the gift and support that he had received. They think that's sort of odd. Another point that gets made is right in the middle of the letter, Paul says, finally, taloi pan, right, is the Greek phrase, finally. And that's typically something that one sees when you're concluding. And then it actually right after that, Paul talks a little bit about travel plans, which is something he typically does at the end of a letter. So the idea is like, well, maybe he's ending there as well. And so there are different theories that were produced. Was Philippians 2 letters? Was it 3 letters? And different theories that sort of come out, that the idea that at some point a scribe, maybe at Philippi, took all of these letters, put them together as one, and then that's what got handed down through history. Now, the challenge to that, so for the largest history of the church, the integrity of the letter wasn't even a matter of debate. And then in the last sort of 150 years or so, it became a matter of debate. In the last 60, 70 years, that's picked up a little more steam. And in the last 30 years, actually, the integrity of the letter has become much more assumed because of actually rhetorical criticism. So what a couple of scholars started to do was to look at ancient rhetoric, ancient speeches, and how they would flow and how they would be, put together. And using that as a lens, then examining Philippians, it was like, okay, wait a minute. Actually, the way Philippians operates, it operates in a way very consistent with ancient speeches. And that actually then began to say, okay, well, maybe this letter makes sense as a single composition. Like, in other words, it becomes harder to argue that there would have been multiple letters if it makes sense already as a standalone single composition. And then there are other things like we don't have a textual history of different letters and different fragments. Like even so, if it did become one single letter, it had to happen early. But it's really been a rhetorical criticism that has begun to move that argument back towards the letter as one letter. And that's important. The reason that's important for us is this. When you're interpreting a letter, so you're reading chapter 4, for example, how much of chapters 1 through 3 inform how you understand chapter 4? Well, if it's a single composition, then everything in chapters 1 through 3 informs how you understand chapter 4. But if chapter 4 was a standalone letter that was sent early, if the end of 4 was sent early and first, then very little of chapters 1 through 3 will actually inform how you understand chapter 4, at least as in terms of a direct argument. So that's where the integrity does sort of matter in our interpretation of the letter.
All right, so more on the letter, the provenance of the letter and the dating of Philippians, and if you could define provenance for us in this case.
Sure. So when we talk about
along with that, sorry to interrupt, is that also Paul's situation in prison. If you could speak more about that, what he was going through.
So one of the things we know is Paul's in prison when he's writing. So he's writing to the church at Philippi and he's in prison. He references that right off the bat early in his letter about being in chains, they're awaiting a trial, that's coming up. So we know he's writing from prison. We don't know exactly why he was arrested. The reason we don't so it could have been he's arrested for, proclaiming a ruler other than Caesar. Right, which is we know what will develop later on, sort of a rejection of the imperial cult, rejection of the emperor as a god. It will develop, but that movement actually takes place just a few decades later. I mean, this is what we have in Revelation. That type of persecution begins. A lot of times, some of the arrests and persecution could just happen under disturbance of the peace. Where someone is arrested, not because they're necessarily a anti-emperor, but because they've been accused of disturbing the peace. So we don't know exactly the charge that was in play, but we know he's in prison. The question is, where is he in prison? And the where helps define a little bit the when. So the long-standing traditional argument has been that Paul is in prison in Rome when he's writing this, which we know Paul was imprisoned in Rome. That makes good sense. In Philippians, Paul talks about the household of Caesar. He talks about a Praetorian guard. So he makes those references, so all which would then lead to a reasonable argument that Paul is writing from his imprisonment in Rome, which if that's the case, then we know Paul was in prison in the early 60s. So that puts that makes it one of his later epistles. And a lot of people see a very reflective, gentle, calm Paul writing during that time period. The problem with a Roman provenance, so provenance is sort of where the letter is coming from, is the distance between Philippi and Rome. So the distance by land is about 700 miles. By sea, it would be like 900 miles for someone to travel. And the reason that's an issue is Philippians has a lot of traveling going on. You've got Epaphroditus, coming to Paul. Along the way, he gets sick. News gets back to the people that Epaphroditus is sick. Paul knows that the people think, that Epaphroditus is sick. Paul's going to send Epaphroditus back. He's going to send Timothy. He expects Timothy to get back to him, and he expects himself to get back to the Philippians shortly. In other words, that's a lot of travel. And Paul seems to think this is all going to happen relatively quickly, some of this traveling. That he expects to send Timothy soon and hear back soon, and visit them soon. So that's why Rome becomes a challenge. So one of the other arguments, or the main arguments, and this is one I have found more convincing because of this distance, is Ephesus. Now, What do we know about Ephesus? We know it's large. It's one of the largest cities in the Greco-Roman world. It would have had a Praetorian Guard. It would have had a group that would have been in a household of Caesar, like that didn't only exist in Rome. So it would have had all of those trappings. It's very close to Philippi, it's about 100 miles. So all those travels can make some sense, then given its proximity. We know that Paul sends people to Macedonia while he's in Ephesus. Like we get that in Acts, where he sends people to Macedonia, like Timothy and others. So that makes sense. What's the challenge to Ephesus then? Like, why hasn't that been won today? Like, why isn't everybody from church tradition been Ephesus? We have no statement in Acts that Paul was imprisoned in Ephesus. Now, we have to be careful what we expect Luke to do in Acts. Luke isn't about writing everything that happened to Paul or everything that happened to apostles. He has a very specific purpose for writing Acts. So he's not going to cover, I don't think it's reasonable for us to assume he covers every single imprisonment. We do know Paul suffered in Ephesus, and he talks about, dogs that he would contend with, and the beatings and things like that were part of his ministry. He references that, which we don't have direct records of. So what many have argued, and I've found convincing, is it's reasonable to assume Paul was in prison in Ephesus. And so if it's reasonable to assume Paul was in prison in Ephesus, then Ephesus as a province makes sense. And here's how it affects dating. If it's when he's in Ephesus, then he's writing it in the 50s, which means he's writing it about the same time he's writing Galatians and his Corinthian correspondence. And the arguments and the issues he's taking on Philippians fit a lot more cleanly with what he talks about in Galatians and First Corinthians than what he does with some of his later epistles, which one might have assumed would have been a similarity if he was writing from Rome. And there are other options, Caesarea, etc., but those are really the two major options, is the traditional option of Rome, which I think most scholars still hold, Ephesus, which a large minority of scholars hold, 60s versus 50s, but still in prison from both of them.
Interesting. And so it's very important for you to see the gospel, Paul's gospel, and the gospel mission. And so that's throughout the letter. What is significant about that, especially as Paul's gospel is distinguished between other gospels?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's interesting. It's probably something that I came to appreciate as in further into my studies, was that Paul, the pastoral Paul, he does spend time with his churches, helping encourage them not to fall back into paganism, not to fall back into, those sinful ways. But he spends the vast majority of time making sure that they don't have a faulty understanding of who Jesus is. That his pastoral heart wasn't governed by a concern that they would sort of abandon Christ and the gospel for back to paganism, but rather that they would have a faulty understanding, a false understanding of who Jesus is, a false understanding of his gospel. And that for Paul, why he was there, they're called to be the apostle to the Gentiles and proclaim the gospel, and so like to reject him to reject his mission would align with rejecting the true gospel. And I think, that was very informative for me, even in my own sort of work in the church and in my own life, about the importance of understanding who Jesus is versus a false understanding of who Jesus is. And I think that's what we see in Philippians and if you think through, in the ancient world, the idea was, if you were right with God, if you were right with the gods, you were blessed. If you were out of step with the gods' favor or out of step with God, you were cursed. That was the relationship, right? The gods like you, things were good. If they didn't, things are bad. So here you have Paul in prison. And so for the Philippians, it's very natural for them to think,
right.
Have we backed the wrong gospel? Right? Has he been cursed? Is this the wrong? Because he's in prison and he's not supposed to be in prison because he's supposed to be with God. For Paul to then to write and say, no, you need to understand who Jesus is. You need to understand that I'm not here, because of the gospel in the sense that I'm somehow out of step. I'm here because this is exactly where God wants me. This is the exact expression of the gospel mission in its right. This persevering through suffering, cross to the resurrection. And so I think that is part of what is this project of Paul encouraging them to understand his imprisonment within the right understanding of who Jesus is in the gospel.
All righty. Well, that ties into one of the other themes you addressed, which is perseverance, which ties in with joy. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah. I mean, there's nothing like reading Philippians. It's I would joke with my class, it's happy Paul, right? I mean, it's because the idea of joy and rejoice is all the way through. And what you start to see in that is that what Paul rejoices in is in their partnership. He's always saying, I will rejoice in you, you rejoice in me, we rejoice in this. I mean, there's always this fellowship, this partnership of rejoicing that's happening. And what they're rejoicing in is in what God is doing, his great will, great plan unfolding in the gospel of Jesus. And then that rejoicing runs in partnership, in complementary to perseverance. So they're not against each other. And it's very easy from a worldly standpoint to equate perseverance with something you do when it's hard and you got to get through it. You don't enjoy it, but what Paul is saying, perseverance and joy go together. Because our perseverance of maintaining, through suffering, and whether it's imprisonment, whether it's suffering the rejection of people who should be with you, whether it's in enduring the hardships that come with proclaiming Christ, that's actually also a moment of joy. And so you have that great statement in Philippians, that statement that is sometimes hard for us to swallow, which when he says to them at the end of chapter 1, it has not only been given to you to believe, but also to suffer. And so what Paul's doing there is the giving language, that's gifting language. It's not only been gifted to you believe, which we're very good with faith being a gift, but he said, but also to suffer. And then he says, and he explains why, because that's a sign. It's a sign of their destruction, meaning those that stand against you, but of your salvation. And this is from God. And so this perseverance is an occasion for joy, because it also is proclaiming, you're with God and you're doing exactly what God wants you to be doing. And so we rejoice in that. So they work together, and you see that through Philippians all the way through.
And what about the Philippians gift? If you could offer us some background information on what sort of financial sharing might have taken place within Judaism as well as pagan culture at the time, and then how this was significant for Paul in the Philippians.
Sure, good. So one of the things is what the Philippians gave to him was a financial support. In fact, when you look at the end with chapter 4, when he is discussing the gift, he talks about it, about matters of giving and receiving, and that's language talking about accounting and financing, and he says, that he's saying you don't need to send any more. The support language is certainly a tangible supply, a tangible support. And when you were in prison in the ancient world, it's very different. There wasn't the state didn't supply you with 3 hots and a cot, right? The state didn't give you your meals and your blankets and your clothing. You were responsible for your own support when you were in prison. The state didn't care if you died in prison. That wasn't a welfare system of their concern at all. So if you were in prison, you relied on the support of others for your own sustenance, for your own continuance. What's interesting, and probably I think when you turn the Greco-Roman world, that is the delicate line that Paul is trying to walk through is relationships were very much defined in terms of honor and shame. They were very much defined in terms of patron and client. And it worked this way. So, like, Dennis, if you had something that I needed, and I couldn't get it for myself, so I needed it from you, I would then go ask for it from you. At that moment, you have gained in honor, and I have taken a position of shame because you have something that I don't have. And then you become my patron, and I've become your client. So you would then give to me whatever I was needing, but I, in return, would then brag about you, would proclaim how great you are, would honor you. I would be underneath you in that relationship. Because you had a need, I had a need, and you could fill it. And so I meet your wants by proclaiming your honor. That's how things would work in the ancient world. And so what Paul has to walk very carefully through is to make sure that isn't what occurs with the Philippians. So when he is writing at the end and says, not that I was in, you were right to send to me, but not because I was in need. I have known to be content in all circumstances. And he says, and God will, later on, he says, God will repay you. He is helping safeguard that what they have done in giving him supplies has not resulted in a patron-client relationship where Paul becomes the client of the Philippian church, where he becomes sort of under their employ, for lack of a better term. And so that's, I think, more than anything, I think it's very helpful for us to understand what is occurring there, which is why, for example, Paul doesn't do the same thing with the church of Corinth. The church of Corinth, he's like, I had a right to earn from what I was doing, but I have my own business. I took care of myself. And the reason he's doing that is because he can't trust the church of Corinth to understand that relationship correctly. He knows that the Corinthians, which are so enamored by patron-client, are so enamored by honor-shame, the Corinthians are acting like Corinthians. That's their main problem, is they're still acting like the world. That they will turn and say, you're our speaker. You're our apostle in terms of a patron-client ownership language because of what would have happened there. So he doesn't take money from the Corinthians, but he does from the Philippians, which speaks to how healthy they are, that he can trust them with that. While at the same time, he's wanting to continue to protect them from reading those finances, that support, within a patron-client relationship, which would have been the dominant way of understanding the exchange of money and services and support in the Greco-Roman world. So it's interesting how he cares for them, even in his hesitant thank you, as it's sometimes been called, at the end of chapter 4.
Wow, that's really significant. That's something to think about more. So you had mentioned the rhetorical structure before, so let's get into that into more detail. What are the different parts of the letter, and what are the Latin terms, and if you could define each of those, and then we'll explore each section in more detail.
Excellent. So Paul's letters are, in terms of ancient letters, are really long. Ancient letters were not that long. They were usually very brief. Paul's letters, even Philippians, in only 4 chapters, is a long letter, let alone when you get into 1 Corinthians, Romans, etc. In terms of length, they're actually more similar to speeches. And we actually have a lot of information about how ancient speeches were organized. When I was in school, you learned the 5-paragraph theme, right? There were organizational structures you learned, the thesis, 3 arguments, conclusion, right? That kind of stuff. Well, that existed in the ancient world as well, that there was a way of organizing an argument. And one of the things that in looking at Paul's letters, for some of his letters, it's been helpful to actually use that rhetorical criticism, that way of organizing, to understand what the letter and how different parts are moving. And so how the different parts would work is the very beginning would be an exordium. And what an exordium did, it went to accomplish 2 things. One was create a favorable hearing, so that the exordium is usually where you would receive you would hear both the credentials of the speaker and also something that would make the audience want to hear. We do this all the time. Let me introduce to you so-and-so. You introduced me, you did a little bit of that. Like you gave where I work and what I've written. Like that was a little bit of an idea of hoping to engender a positive audience and a credibility. That's what the exordium would do, and it would begin to just introduce the theme. After the exordium, so the exordium is important because it starts to tickle what the main idea is going to be about. After the exordium, you would, not always, but if you had one, you would sometimes have an event that would be described or presented. That event would be called a narratio. And the speaker would choose an event that they felt helped best present the idea they want to talk about. So they would capture an event. It would either be something that they're wanting to introduce that the audience has no idea about that event, or it could be an event that they're wanting them to see from a very specific perspective. So that's why you usually see an exordium, then some sort of event, the narratio, and then following the narratio, you get the main thesis of the argument. The main proposition, or the Latin would be the propositio. You get the thesis, and that helps us in interpretation be like, all right, I see this exordium, now I see an event, I know what comes next is going to be the thesis. And then after the thesis, you have all the proofs to the thesis, which are called the Probatio. Now, when we think of proofs, we can think of that typically in how you prove an argument is true. Like, you make I can tell you that it was Colonel Mustard with the candlestick because Colonel Mustard was, did not have the wrench. And I know he didn't, you could do the clue argument. We tend to think of proofs that way. And certainly in ancient rhetoric, there would be that occasion. But proofs also could be understood differently. So, for example, proofs might be presenting new ways of unfolding or unpacking the thesis. So taking the thesis and say, now look at it this way. So it could be restatements of the thesis, or it could be examples of people or examples of events that show the argument or help explain it. So proofs don't necessarily have to be the idea of prove it. It can also be kind of a way of demonstrating it. And that would be the Probatio. Then following that, you would usually have what was called the Peroratio, which is towards the end, it'd be a high emotion summary, and there's usually a lot of high rhetoric, emotive words, flowery sometimes. And that was usually the idea it would create an emotional end to the argument, which helps solidify its conviction. And then sometimes after that, you could have final elements that a denouement, right? Little things at the end that are connected to it, but have a little bit of variety in what the speaker or the writer wanted to do. So that's kind of a general structure that we know ancient rhetoric would follow. And when we look at Philippians, we actually see that structure. Now, it doesn't mean Paul follows that structure in every one of his epistles, but in Philippians, it does seem he follows that path that we see in ancient speech presenting, and that helps us understand what he's doing in the epistle.
Okay, great. So let's take a look at the exordium, which starts with chapter 1, verse 1. From Paul and Timothy, slaves of Christ Jesus, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are in Philippi with the overseers and deacons. And then it continues on. What is important for us to know about that whole section?
Good. So right off the bat in that section, what should probably stands out is the emphasis Paul puts on their fellowship, their mutuality, their partnership. He talks about how they've been, fellowships in his imprisonment, and how he yearns for them and he loves them, and it's right for him to feel that way. And then he talks about how they love him, and so he's signaling right off the bat that this letter one is going to be a positive one, right? It doesn't come out with you foolish Galatians, right? It doesn't come out strong. It doesn't even come out strong with an apostolic defense. And a lot of Paul starts his letters by affirming his apostleship. He doesn't do that, here. In fact, he uses servant language, slave language, which also signals the humility is going to be a strong part. So in that opening of the Exordium, one of the things as a reader of Philippians we're struck with immediately is the partnership and the fellowship is a loving one. It's centered on the gospel. Paul is praying for them, and he is celebrating their continued fidelity to him. And that this is going to be a positive letter, something that, stress that. Also with a hint of humility. You have chains, you have servant, and you have imprisonment language. So we know that he's hinting at that humility is going to be a part of this letter.
All right, then the Narratio starts with verse 12 in chapter 1. He writes, I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that my situation has actually turned out to advance the gospel.
So imprisonment, right? So right off the bat, he introduces an event, which in rhetorical criticism we would expect. And what's the event? His imprisonment. And he's writing his imprisonment to help them have the right perspective of it. It doesn't seem like they were unaware of it. So when he starts out, I want you to understand what's really happening here. Like God is at work. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And he cites two things. One, he cites, first of all, that his knowledge of why he's in imprisonment for Christ has gone so far that even like places you never thought would hear about Jesus, the Roman guard, right? They're hearing about Jesus because of my imprisonment. But then he also talks about another positive effect, is that there are people, believers, who are even more bold, who stand without fear to proclaim the gospel more boldly because of his imprisonment. So there are people at Rome or Ephesus, depending on where you think he is, that are believers that are now even encouraged all the more. And that presents for the Philippians, hey, here's what an authentic response to my imprisonment is. It's boldness to understand that this is exactly what Paul's supposed to be. This is exactly where. So right after he says, hey, this is how I want you to see this, that God's at work, that the mission you're backing is still going exactly where it's supposed to be. And there are people emboldened by it. What's also interesting in his discussion of the imprisonment is because he then talks about there are those around him who are trying to take advantage of this situation, who are trying to increase his hardship. He doesn't actually spend hardly any time talking about his jailers. He doesn't talk about the suffering he's experiencing physically. He doesn't talk about if he's been beaten or not. He doesn't talk about the Roman jailers hardly at all. What's causing him stress are the people who present as if they should be, affirming the gospel and following Christ, actually seeking to take advantage of the situation, for their own benefit. And so Paul, earlier on in the Narratio, which he's going to, expand out later in the epistle, is also saying, here is what a faulty response looks like. The positive response, proclaim more boldly, in fellowship with me. The faulty response is to actually seek your own advantage, to see opportunities to lift yourself up. And that, of course, is going to anticipate the Christ hymn when we get to that, the paradigm of surrendering yourself and not seeking your own advantage, in service to God. So he's already kind of presenting that. Now, one of the big challenges in that section, and no one knows exactly what to do with it, is when he says, for good or ill doesn't matter as long as Christ is proclaimed, which sounds really good on its surface, except for the fact that nowhere else does Paul ever say something at all like that. Nowhere else does Paul say, I don't care about your motivation as long as your words are right. Paul's always about the heart, always about. In fact, when he talks about envy and jealousy and people seeking their own advantage in other letters, he says they have no place in the kingdom. So to all of a sudden have Paul saying, it doesn't matter as long as you get the words right, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. Now, so I think there's a couple ways to sort of navigate through that. Admittedly, I think they're choppy. If these were clean, there wouldn't be a problem. One of the ways to navigate through it is punctuation. We know that the punctuation is a later addition to the interpretation of the letters. So it's possible that we've punctuated it wrong. I sometimes think that's an easy out, but it's possible, where Paul is actually saying, for good or ill, does it matter? Period. Yes, it matters in every way, because, and then he's sort of the assumption that he's affirming that, yeah, it is a big deal. Or maybe the good or for ill isn't talking about their motivations, but actually talking about, whether people are for me or against me, it doesn't matter. Christ is proclaimed. That the good and the ill is actually his own circumstances. And again, both of those are challenging in their own respects. But so is the idea that Paul doesn't care what your motivation or your heart is, as long as you proclaim who Jesus is. That goes against what he's going to say about the Christ hymn, and who Christ is, and the standpoint. But needless to say, he's framing the imprisonment as, I'm suffering and I'm praising the Lord because I'm right where I'm supposed to be. And people who see this correctly are even more boldly to proclaim who Christ is.
Okay, and so we move to the Propositio in chapter 1, verse 27. He writes, "Only conduct yourselves in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or whether I remain absent, I should hear that you are standing firm."
Yeah, and I would even expand that all the way to 127 through verse 30. Like that the Propositio, that's the thesis. And that's one sentence in Greek. A lot of times in our English translations, we'll take a really long sentence and we'll make it into multiple sentences because we love people, and these really long sentences get challenging. So we're right to do that. I love that. That's the thesis. That is the dominant imperative. Conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the gospel. And I won't spend too long on this, but that word conduct, the Greek word behind it is polituesta. Polituesta, polis. It's where we get city, metropolis, Indianapolis, right? Polis. It's that word that we translate as conduct. Paul doesn't use the imperative form anyplace else. It's the only place in all of his letters he uses it. And it's more than just conduct. It has the idea of conduct yourself as a citizen would. So it has the idea of your manner should reflect the body of which you belong to. So it's more than just a statement of live a right life, if you will. He loves ethical statements like live and walk, and he uses those throughout. But here it's as a citizen of heaven. And he talks about citizenship language later, right? As a citizen of the gospel, this is what you look like. This is what you do. I have 3 boys, and raising them up, they'd be, a Jennings is kind, like a Jennings, is respectful to their elders. Like there's an idea, because you belong to the Jennings clan, there are certain things that go along with being that. It's that idea, it's this citizenship, this polituesta, that is that driving imperative.
All righty, and then next we have the Probatio section that starts in chapter 2, verse 1, and goes all the way up to chapter 4, verse 3. Paul writes, "Therefore, if there is any encouragement in Christ, any comfort provided by love, any fellowship in the Spirit." That's the way he starts it off. And so we got a big section here. How would you sum that up and see what's significant?
Good. So that entire next section is the Probatio, which is, as you call, our proofs, right? This is then Paul is presenting evidence in support of his thesis. And when we think of evidence in support of it, he does it in a couple of different ways. One is he presents complementary imperatives. One thing I've always said is to know Philippians is to know its imperatives. That all the different imperatives, which he starts out with, make my joy complete, like that's the first one. And that's talking about, when he talks about make my joy complete, he's talking about, that this relationship, this fellowship, this commitment to the gospel. So it's not like a narcissistic make me happier. It's like, man, I want to keep praising the Lord. So keep doing this so I can keep praising the Lord. Then you've got imperatives. As you've always obeyed, put your salvation into operation, work out your salvation. You have about the Christ hymn, about imitating Christ. You have these series of imperatives that happen, all the way through. So that's part of the proofs, are different ways of saying, conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the gospel. And then he uses people as proofs. He uses Jesus as a proof. So the Christ hymn is a proof, is the exemplar of what it looks like to conduct yourself in a manner consistent with the gospel, which is that, emptying for God's will, for others, not seeking your own advantage. He uses Timothy as a proof. Timothy has a deep love for the Philippians, and as it will serve them. Epaphroditus is one of his greatest proofs. He says, look at Epaphroditus, and there's even almost like a Christ hymn overlay. Epaphroditus, who almost to the point of death, is Paul's language, served the gospel mission, to bring this gift. And then he sends Epaphroditus back and says, imitate people like him, look at him and others like him. They're serving sacrificially, not thinking of their own well-being. And then he presents himself as a proof. And he says something that seems like we would never want to say, which is imitate me as I imitate Christ. It seems, who would want to say that? Well, Paul, because Paul's pouring himself out fully for them. He says, I don't know, like, I'd rather be with Christ than to be here, but being here is good for your faith. So I know I'm going to remain. He says, if I have to be poured out as the libation on the sacrifice of your faith, I will rejoice. Meaning, if I have to sacrifice everything for you, I will rejoice. I mean, that's what, Paul presents, and that's why he even talks about his own story. I love his own story, because his own story is like, I had all of this. I was not some sap walking aimlessly in need of certainty, and I found some sort of certainty in the faith. I had a great name. I had a great lineage. I had a great family line. I had all this respect. I had everything that should give me confidence. And I consider it all to be rubbish, to be dung in light of the cross and the resurrection. I want to know the joy of his resurrection. I surrendered all of that for what I know is the beauty of the gospel. And so he presents as part of his proofs all of these people as well, which I think is fantastic, which is just cool how he presents it. So that's what you see in that larger section, different ways of presenting the imperative and examples of also what people living out that imperative look like.
So you made it clear where you see the Christ hymn, the kenosis, the self-emptying, where it fits in with the overall thrust of the letter. But of course, people take it a lot further, and they're looking for all sorts of deep Christological evidence about this way of thinking or that. How far can we go with that in seeking out deeper truths, or is that just misguided?
Great question. I mean, the Christ hymn is it's the part of Philippians, right? I mean, it's such a beautiful, majestic piece. It's like the old book Animal Farm, right? All animals are created equal, but some are more equal than others. Like, there's sometimes you get to scripture, all passages are created equal, but some are more equal than others, right? There's the Christ hymn, like it's one of those pieces. And the beauty of it is because we get this, picture of almost inside the Trinity, at least within the Father-Son relationship, and what Jesus is doing, and the emptying Jesus in obedience to God, and then even at the very end, it's not Jesus claiming his own exaltation, it's God exalting him. It's the Father giving him, quoting Isaiah, the name that's above every name. The name that belongs to God is now to be understood, as belonging to the Son as well. It's a beautiful, powerful picture. And so then and even in the middle of all this, you have wonderful Adam language, right? Where Adam, who was made in the image of God, yet sought his own advantage, tried to grasp it, and become like gods with the eating of the fruit, and whereas Jesus did not do that. I mean, it's just some beautiful, powerful, Old Testament filled language and pictures here. So the question is sort of becomes is like, what are we supposed to do with this? Is this, is this kenotic hymn, this emptying hymn, is this what's this a picture of? How far are we to understand what Jesus emptied himself of? How far what God the Son rather emptied himself of? How far are we to understand what's the view? And I think that becomes complicated, partially because the hymn isn't intended to answer that question. The hymn isn't intended to answer how much of the divine prerogatives that God the Son temporarily lay down, at the incarnation. What the hymn is not intended. It's not intended to say, did he empty himself of this or did he empty himself of that? What the hymn is intended to do is to say that he emptied himself. Like that. That's the arc of the hymn. Now, there's the Greek here is fascinating. There are two ways of understanding the beginning of it. One is that who, although being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, something to be taken for advantage. The idea of, although he is God, didn't take advantage of that. You could also translate it this way, and a lot of good evangelical scholarship affirms this, is not although being in the very nature God, but because he was in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God. In other words, it's not despite being God, he doesn't do this. It's because he is who he is. He lays it down. And the way the Greek works, the participle, that seems like how can an although, a concessive and a causal, be both possible in the language? And that's part of just the way some of the Greek participles work. And of course, both theologically hold true. But in looking at Philippians as a whole, I think what Paul is doing in Philippians is he's saying to the church, because you are in Christ, you can persevere and you can be humble and you can lay down and you can not seek your own advantage. And because I see that running through the epistle, is I become more and more convinced that he's saying it's because Christ is who he is. It's because he's God the Son. He could do what Adam could not do and what anyone else cannot do unless they're in Christ. He could lay down his own advantage for the purpose of submitting obediently to God. And so it's interesting just, how even how the whole of the epistle can inform our understanding of the hymn. So that's what I think it's doing. So that's why when I look at the hymn, I might look elsewhere in maybe the Gospels, for example, of where was Jesus limited, where was he not limited? Obviously he was limited and became flesh, when he was doing his ministry. I might look elsewhere to answer some of those questions, but not to the Christ hymn. To the Christ hymn, what God is telling me through Paul is, God the Son emptied himself fully, completely, all the way to the cross for the gospel, for the good news that is being accomplished at the cross through Jesus, and that God the Father exalted him. And so then for the believer, what that says to me is that's the way I go. I'm to be humble and I'm to serve and I'm to be, for God's will and for the proclamation of the gospel and empty myself completely. And I also know that God promises there is exaltation that awaits. There is heaven, there is glory, there is the kingdom of God that awaits, as well. But it is not me screaming, I've earned it. It is God saying, well done, good and faithful servant. It is such a different sort of move, which is why it's such a beautiful and powerful piece of Philippians.
Excellent. Okay, so possibly it should be translated because rather than although. That's very significant.
Yeah. Either one are possible. Either one.
All righty. So moving on to the Peroratio, starts with chapter 4, verse 4. up to verse 9. And Paul writes, "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice." So what do we have here?
Yeah. So this is that emotional end, right? This is that, flurry of terms that's meant to, anchor in what the argument that's just been presented. And so what I love about this piece is one of the probably the most common areas in this things is this command, whatever is noble, whatever is honorable, think on these things, that section falls here. Paul hasn't sort of moved aside to a whole different topic. I mean, he's saying he's taking actually language that was well known within Stoicism. I mean, this is stuff that was not just we restricted to Judaism and early Christianity, but he's taking those terms and saying, and what is good, what is honorable, what are the things you should be thinking on? It's everything I've just said. Like that's what you should be thinking on. Those are the things that are our focus. And so it while it certainly has a natural extrapolation into all the things, like Philippians isn't the entirety of the message of Scripture, and so that I would say is right to extrapolate to the other things about thinking all of what God has to say and speak. But let's not lose sight of when he's talking about these things, he's talking about it in the context of faithful partnership for the gospel and the proclamation of the gospel.
So that takes us to the concluding arguments, the denouement that starts with chapter 4, verse 10 goes to verse 20. And Paul writes, "I have great joy in the Lord because now at last you have again expressed your concern for me."
Good. Yeah.
So where do we go with this?
So now he's ready to talk about the gift. I think he purposely waited to talk about the gift because now he's ready to talk about their support that has re-blossomed. And now they're ready to understand it correctly. They're ready to see that their support of the mission might have been even so much more than what they thought it was. That what he's saying, now you're ready to understand that your support, your sacrifice, your giving, your partnership with me is a loud witness and testament to who you are, in the kingdom, working for God and his purposes. And so he doesn't delay the gift because he feels weird talking about money. He's now says, now you're ready to have the right perspective. Now I'm ready for you to understand what has actually happened and why I'm rejoicing like crazy when Epaphroditus showed up with your support, because this is what is case. Now we have to be very careful here. This kind of argument can be used in very manipulative ways. Like it doesn't go too far for all of a sudden to see pastors and ministers and people say, hey, your gift to me is going to be an indicator actually of if you love God. I mean, this could become used in some very dangerous ways. And to that, what you're saying is like, in anytime you're sort of giving, anytime you're supporting and prayerfully considering who you're giving to, look what Paul looked like. Like, is this a person who you can say, is this a ministry that you can say they are emptying themselves? They are pouring themselves out for the gospel. They are indicative of someone who's living that life of conduct in a manner fitting the gospel. This ministry is doing it because that's the mark of what you should be in partnership with or not. If it's someone who's seeking advantage over somebody else, who is finding themselves in competition and trying to take advantage of somebody else's hardship or some mentor's hardship, or they themselves are living a life where you clearly are gaining, from it in a way and worldly standards, and then that's a mark. Of it. But that shouldn't release us of the fact that our support, our financial support is one of what God is doing, is one of the ways God has been moving his kingdom forward. There are those who are sent, and then there are those who fund the senders, right? And there's the senders, the ones who are supplying it. God's at both. And that's what I love about Philippians, is because Philippians also allows us to see how beautiful are the people supporting the ones going out and doing the ministry. that Paul doesn't draw a distinction between the greater work of going and the lesser work of sending. He says this is all God's great doing. Let's rejoice together. And I think that's a very beautiful word, for the church today as well.
And you touched on this some already, but what more can you say about the opponents of Paul? What can we know about them? It seems like there's a few hints in there.
Yeah. So there's always a question of who are Paul's rivals? What do they believe? Like in Galatians, we get a much stronger sense of what that there is this, you have to follow Torah stipulations. You can believe in Christ, but you also have to adhere to Jewish law in order to be assured your place in the kingdom. We have a pretty good idea of those opponents. We actually might have that same reality potentially happening in Philippians because Paul spends some time in his own biography talking about that. There are a lot of different arguments, are these people, are Paul's opponents here, those who are arguing like some sort of prosperity mission that it can't be because Paul's in prison, that the right understanding of Christ is one that just overflows with material blessing. What is actually occurring here? Paul actually puts them all under one umbrella, which is enemies of the cross. So when Paul talks about opponents, he just refers to them as enemies of the cross. He doesn't even actually get into a lot of specific details, other than, I think, to say those people who are trying to take advantage of my situation and advance themselves. If you look at those people, and these aren't pagan Romans coming in, like these are people who present themselves as if they're part of the Christian identity. That those who are trying to advance their own agenda, if you look at them through the Christ hymn, you see them as enemies of the cross. And so I do think you get a hint that he's talking about that type of diagnostic, but he puts them all under enemies of the cross, which I think allows him to say any group that's against the gospel is an enemy of the cross. And then I won't spend too much time, but I really think Paul talks about three different groups of people in his letters: brothers, pagan unbelievers, and false brothers. And it's the false brothers that actually receive the strongest language of warning and concern from Paul. It's the false brothers that are the ones that I think get the enmity language so much more strongly than even the ones who are of the pagan world, of which we all belong to before we became followers of Christ.
Excellent. And what would you say are some of the significant debates that are still going on, theological debates concerning the letter of Philippians?
Good. Yeah, great question. I mean, I think like we talked a little bit about, what's happening with the Christ hymn and how much can be pulled out of that. I mean, I think probably one of the debates that still sort of continues in Philippians, maybe, and I don't know if a theological debate would be as much as a stress of emphasis would be, is this a unity problem? And I think when we look at Philippians, as a lot of scholars do, and a lot of pastors and theologians do, as a unity within the church issue, I think we miss some of the strength that Paul is actually talking about, a collective unity for the gospel and for the gospel mission, rather than sort of disunity within the church. And so I think we might elevate some things that into a interpretation of how do you form unity in a church, instead of what we're supposed to do is look at this language of how do we as a church be unified in a mission that's going out. Because even the conflict on Euodia and Syntyche, and there's certainly something happened between those two women. It's clear. Paul waits very long to talk about it and doesn't really give a whole lot of details to it, and affirms both women in equal terms. Like if that was something that was splitting the church, you'd think he would have dealt with it in a similar way they did Corinth. So I would think that's probably one of the things I would just encourage people is to don't always read unity language as a problem within the church at Philippi, but look at how it actually might have more to do with being unified together towards the common mission of the gospel.
All righty. And so you talked a lot about the central purpose of the letter, how it's all tied together. But if we were going to develop a theology of the letter of Philippians, would that be any different?
I think there's certainly they go together. I mean, I think like if we talk about a theology of the letter, so if the purpose of the letter is to encourage the Philippians to persevere in their fidelity to the gospel, I would think the theology of the letter might be that God has ordained the movement of His gospel, through the unity of His people. And like I think that might be the sort of theology, and then incorporated under that is what that means. It's a surrendering, to the will and plan of God. It's in partnership and encouragement with one another. It's in rejoicing. It is in suffering. Together. It's sort of recognizing that God is the one at work, and I might even take that verse early on, that the one who began a great work in you will see it to completion. And when I read that as a good Westerner, I think it's a singular you. I think what God is saying is the one who began a good work in you, Mark, the one who began a good work in you, Dennis, God will see to completion. But it's actually a corporate you, it's a plural you. What Paul is actually saying is the one who began a good work in you, church at Philippi, God will see to completion. That doesn't mean God's not doing amazing, wonderful work in our lives and moving through. But the strength of the letter is, the theology of the letter is the one who began the good work, which is His good work in you, church. He is the one who will see it to its completion.
All right. And finally, you've already touched on this quite a bit, but what more could you offer us as far as an application for the whole church? And that's in light of the sort of missionary structures we have, church planning, evangelism, all that tied together. What would be relevant for us today?
Good. I think probably a couple of things that would be relevant. That's relevant for me as this letter speaks to me, and I think it's relevant to the church. Money matters. Right? That money in the sense of not holding it, but money in the sense of giving it. That there is a testimonial act that happens in our giving, in our support of our resources, and that is an active reflection. So I think one of the things is that Christians, we are to be givers. We are to be supporting. We are to be in partnership with our resources, and not just from our discretionary income. Like, this is something we do as a church together. So I think that's one of the things that's a takeaway. Two is making sure we understand the theology of suffering. That we understand that we don't just suffer because we're Christian and in the sense of I accept it, that I hate it, but I accept it. What Paul is telling us is it's a gift. It's a gift, and see it that way. So I think as we think through this humbling, this unity, this sacrificing, this giving, which also comes then in suffering, in a response, that we just need to continue to see the joy in both of that, as part of sort of God's great work. And I love it. I mean, Philippians is a beautiful expression. I would joke, it's a fundraising letter, right? In a lot of ways, but it's what it looks like when you're doing it together in partnership with the gospel, moving forth, as a church in support. And this is a church that's doing it, right? This isn't just Epaphroditus giving a little money here, Yodia giving some support here, Syntyche doing there. It's a church that's in partnership together with a gospel mission that's going out. And I think that's powerful to that corporate effort.
Excellent. All righty. Well, I'm Dennis Metzler, and you've been listening to The Charge. We're here with Mark A. Jennings, professor of New Testament at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. So thank you so much, Dr. Jennings, for being with us.
Thank you. It was a delight. I enjoyed it.
All right. Well, peace to everyone.
Peace.